Montana Territory, 1872. Thomas O'Connor had grown accustomed to the company of coyotes. At 25, he found their howls more honest than most human voices he'd encountered across the unforgiving frontier. The lingering mountain winter had finally released its grip on the valley, leaving behind muddy trails and the promise of spring cattle drives. Thomas rode his dappled gray gelding along the eastern edge of the sprawling Triple R Ranch, where he'd worked these past 3 years, watching the sun climb over distant peaks. A man needs nothing but good land, a strong horse, and distance from trouble, he muttered to himself, a mantra he'd adopted after burying his parents on the long journey west. The war had taken his father, and grief had claimed his mother shortly after. At 16, Thomas had learned that attachments were simply opportunities for loss. The frontier demanded survival above all else, and he'd resolved to meet its terms without complaint. As he crested the hill overlooking Sweetwater Creek, Thomas spotted a thin column of smoke rising from Old Man Jenkins' abandoned barn. The property had stood empty since Jenkins died the previous winter, his distant relatives back east showing no interest in claiming the modest homestead. Thomas frowned, hand moving instinctively to the Remington revolver on his hip. Squatters were common this time of year, drifters following the spring thaw north, sometimes bringing trouble with them. "Let's check it out, Chance," he murmured to his horse, turning toward the weathered structure. The Triple R's foreman would want to know if someone was setting up camp on neighboring land. As he approached, Thomas heard something unexpected, children's voices, rising and falling in unison. He slowed Chance to a walk, curiosity replacing caution. The barn doors stood partially open. Thomas dismounted, tethering Chance to a fence post before approaching silently. He peered through the gap and blinked in surprise. Inside, a young woman stood before a group of 8 children seated on hay bales. Her honey blonde hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, and her blue calico dress, though simple, was clean and well-maintained. Behind her, a slate board balanced precariously on a wooden crate displayed careful chalk lettering. The children, ranging from perhaps 5 to 12 years of age, recited multiplication tables in chorus. 6 times 7 is 42. They chanted as the young woman nodded encouragingly. Thomas must have shifted his weight, causing the ancient door hinge to protest with a metallic groan. The woman turned sharply, revealing striking blue eyes and a face that caused Thomas's practiced indifference to falter momentarily. She couldn't have been more than 22, with delicate features hardened only by what appeared to be fierce determination. "May I help you, sir?" Her voice carried the refined cadence of Eastern education, though her stance suggested she was no stranger to frontier wariness. "I'm Thomas O'Connor, ma'am. I ride for the Triple R." He removed his hat, suddenly conscious of trail dust coating his clothes. Saw smoke and thought to check. The children had fallen silent, watching the exchange with wide eyes. "I'm Faith Summers," she replied, straightening her shoulders. "I've been hired by several families to educate their children. The schoolhouse in town burned down last month, and we've been making do here." She gestured around the barn. "Mr. Jenkins' nephew sent word that we might use the property until more suitable arrangements can be made." Thomas nodded, eyes scanning the makeshift classroom. A small fire carefully contained in a metal box explained the smoke. Several lanterns hung from beams to combat the barn's natural dimness. Despite these efforts, the space remained woefully inadequate, drafty, dusty, and hardly conducive to learning. "It's not ideal," Faith continued, as if reading his thoughts. "But education won't wait for perfect circumstances." Thomas found himself nodding again, struck by her practical determination. "Does the town know you're teaching here?" "Some do. Others prefer not to concern themselves with education." A flash of frustration crossed her face before her professional demeanor returned. "Now, if you'll excuse us, Mr. O'Connor, we were in the middle of arithmetic." Thomas felt summarily dismissed but oddly reluctant to leave. Something about this impromptu school in a decaying barn tugged at him uncomfortably. It reminded him of his own interrupted schooling, of hopes abandoned for survival's sake. "Of course, Miss Summers. Good day to you all." He replaced his hat and backed out of the barn, the children's recitations resuming before he'd even mounted Chance. As he rode back toward the ranch, Thomas couldn't shake the image of Faith Summers standing proudly in that dilapidated barn, as out of place as a rose blooming in a cattle pen. The frontier was no place for refinement or academic pursuits. Those were luxuries that belonged to the settled East. Yet something about her stubborn insistence on creating order amid chaos resonated with him in ways he found unsettling. "Not our concern, Chance," he told his horse firmly. "We've got calves to check on." But 3 days later, when a spring thunderstorm descended on the valley with violent intensity, Thomas found himself riding hard toward Jenkins' barn. The structure had never been particularly sound, and with the torrential downpour, he couldn't help imagining Faith and her students huddled beneath a leaking roof. He arrived to find the situation worse than anticipated. Water streamed through multiple gaps in the aged roof, creating muddy pools on the dirt floor. Faith stood on a rickety ladder, attempting to position a bucket to catch the worst leak, while the children huddled in the driest corner, their books protected beneath oilcloth. "Miss Summers," Thomas called, dismounting hurriedly. "That ladder isn't safe." Faith glanced down, her face displaying a mixture of surprise and stubborn pride. "We're managing, Mr. O'Connor." As if contradicting her words, the ladder shifted ominously. Thomas lunged forward just as it gave way completely. Faith fell with a startled cry, landing directly in his arms, sending them both tumbling into a puddle. For one frozen moment, they stared at each other in mutual shock, rain dripping from the brim of his hat onto her flushed cheeks. Then reality reasserted itself as children's giggles erupted from the corner. "Are you hurt?" Thomas asked, helping her to her feet. "Only my dignity," Faith answered, brushing ineffectually at her sodden skirt. "Thank you for the timely arrival." Thomas surveyed the deteriorating conditions. "This won't do. You can't teach here, not with this storm. It might last for days." Faith's expression hardened. "These children need education, Mr. O'Connor. Many walk miles to attend. I can't simply dismiss them because of weather." Thomas recognized the look of someone who'd made an unbreakable promise to themselves. He'd seen it in his own reflection often enough. The Triple R has a bunkhouse with a separate room for the cook. He's away visiting family. It's dry, warm, and empty. You could use it until this passes. Her eyes widened with surprise at his offer. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose." "It's not kindness, ma'am. It's common sense." Thomas heard the brusqueness in his voice and softened it. "Please. The children will catch their death in here." Faith considered for only a moment before nodding decisively. "Children, gather your things. We're relocating temporarily." The impromptu parade that followed, Thomas leading on horseback, Faith and 8 soggy children trailing behind, drew curious stares from the ranch hands when they arrived at the Triple R. Foreman Harlan Davis raised bushy eyebrows, but, after a brief explanation, simply nodded his approval. "Education's important," he commented gruffly. "My own schooling ended at 9. Never did learn proper fractions." The cook's quarters proved ideal. A single large room with a table big enough for all the children, a pot-bellied stove for warmth, and sturdy walls that repelled the storm's fury. Thomas found himself lingering, ostensibly to ensure they had everything needed, but truthfully fascinated by Faith's ability to transform the space into a classroom within minutes. 7 times 8 is 56, the children chanted, seemingly unperturbed by their change in venue. "You've got quite a knack for this," Thomas observed when the children broke for lunch, eating provisions Faith had produced from her satchel. "Teaching found me rather than the reverse," Faith replied, accepting the coffee he offered. "I came west to assist my uncle's family after my aunt died. Their farm failed last year." A shadow crossed her face. "They moved on to Oregon, but I'd already committed to the school term. I'm 20 years old, unmarried, and determined to fulfill my obligations." Thomas found himself unexpectedly moved by her situation, alone on the frontier, yet steadfast in her purpose. It contradicted everything he believed about survival requiring emotional isolation. "How long will you teach?" he asked. "Until something better comes along for these children." Her blue eyes met his directly. "Everyone deserves the chance to become more than their circumstances dictate, don't you think?" The question lingered with Thomas long after the storm cleared and Faith returned her classroom to the barn. It followed him through cattle roundups and fence mending, demanding answers he wasn't prepared to give. He'd spent years believing the frontier allowed only for survival, not improvement. Faith's philosophy challenged the very foundation of his carefully constructed isolation. 2 weeks passed before Thomas found himself riding toward Jenkins' property again, this time with purpose rather than coincidence guiding him. He'd spent evenings sketching plans by lamplight, calculating lumber requirements, and questioning his own sanity. He found Faith dismissing her students, her smile brightening noticeably upon seeing him. The observation sent an unfamiliar warmth through his chest. "Mr. O'Connor, what brings you back to our humble academy?" Thomas dismounted, suddenly nervous. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and handed it to her. "I had some thoughts about your situation." Faith unfolded the paper, a detailed drawing of a simple but sturdy schoolhouse. Her eyes widened as she examined it. "This is extraordinarily thoughtful," she said softly, "but surely just a pleasant dream." "It doesn't have to be." Thomas gestured toward the barn. "Jenkins' property is sitting empty. His nephew's only concern is eventually selling it. Meanwhile, the land's going to waste." He took a deep breath. "I spoke with several ranchers and townsfolk. Many have children who'd benefit from proper schooling. They've agreed to contribute lumber and labor if someone coordinates the effort." Faith stared at him with undisguised wonder. "And you're volunteering?" Thomas nodded, surprising himself with his certainty. "I know something about building. Before my parents died, my father was teaching me carpentry." "Why would you do this, Mr. O'Connor? You've made it quite clear you believe the frontier is about survival, not flourishing." Her perceptiveness unsettled him. Thomas looked away, focusing on the distant mountains. "Maybe I've been wrong about some things." Construction began the following week. Thomas organized work parties of ranchers and townspeople, many bringing their children to witness the raising of their future schoolhouse. Faith continued teaching in the barn, but each afternoon she would visit the construction site, offering encouragement and occasionally cool water to the workers. Thomas found himself looking forward to these moments more than he cared to admit. There was something about Faith's presence that challenged his long-held belief that emotional connections were liabilities in frontier life. Her determination to create something lasting and meaningful amid harsh conditions made his own philosophy of mere survival seem hollow by comparison. One evening, as Thomas worked alone setting window frames, Faith approached with a basket. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, producing bread, cheese, and apple preserves. They sat together on stacked lumber as the sunset painted the half-finished schoolhouse in golden light. "You've accomplished so much in such short time," Faith observed, watching him with open admiration that made Thomas uncharacteristically flustered. "I've had help," he deflected. "Yes, but they follow your lead." She handed him a slice of bread. "You inspire them, Thomas. You've shown that building something is more powerful than simply enduring." Her use of his first name didn't escape his notice, nor did the way she tucked a stray blonde curl behind her ear as she spoke. "I've spent years believing the frontier only takes things away," he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. "My parents, my home back east, any plans beyond the next season. I convinced myself that attachment only leads to loss." Faith considered this thoughtfully. "And now I'm not so certain." He met her gaze directly. "Watching you teach those children in a leaking barn made me question everything I thought I knew about survival." A comfortable silence settled between them as the first stars appeared. Thomas felt a strange peace in Faith's company, a sensation so unfamiliar it almost frightened him. "Will you tell me about your parents?" Faith asked softly. Thomas hesitated only briefly before the story poured from him. His father's woodworking shop in Pennsylvania, his mother's garden, their decision to seek opportunity in the West, the fever that took his father during the war, his mother's subsequent decline. Words he hadn't spoken in years found voice in the gathering dusk. "You've carried that alone for so long," Faith said when he finished, her hand briefly touching his in a gesture of compassion that sent warmth radiating up his arm. "It seemed safer that way," he answered. "Safer, perhaps, but terribly lonely." Her insight cut through his defenses with gentle precision. The schoolhouse progressed rapidly through the summer months. Thomas found himself inventing reasons to visit Faith's classroom, bringing fresh chalk, offering to repair benches, even listening to the older students practice their recitations. Each interaction weakened his resolve to maintain emotional distance, like water gradually eroding stone. The community's enthusiasm for the project grew as the structure took shape. Women formed a committee to acquire proper desks and books. Men debated the merits of different stove designs for winter heating. Even the town council, previously indifferent to educational matters, voted to provide a modest stipend for Faith's teaching position. In late August, as Thomas installed the schoolhouse bell, Sheriff Mills rode out with unexpected news. Jenkins' nephew finally responded about the property, he announced, handing Thomas a telegram. Says he's selling to a cattle operation out of Wyoming. They'll take possession in October. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him. What about the schoolhouse? We've put everything into it. Sheriff Mills shrugged helplessly. New owners can do as they please. Legally, it's their land now. When Thomas broke the news to Faith that evening, her composure finally cracked. Tears welled in her blue eyes as she surveyed the nearly completed schoolhouse. All this work, she whispered, voice breaking. All these hopes. I should have known better than to build dreams on borrowed land. Thomas felt her disappointment like a physical pain. I'll speak to them when they arrive. Maybe they'll allow the school to remain. Faith shook her head sadly. Cattle operations need land for grazing, not education. I was foolish to believe we could create something permanent here. Her despondency struck Thomas profoundly. Faith had always been the one with unwavering faith in possibility. Seeing her resigned to defeat challenged something fundamental within him. That night, Thomas rode back to the Triple R consumed by thoughts he couldn't quiet. Faith's situation echoed his own long-standing fears, that any attempt to build something meaningful on the frontier was ultimately doomed. Yet the alternative, retreating into mere survival, suddenly seemed unthinkable. Dawn found him in the foreman's office, ledger open before him. You're cashing out your stake in the herd? Harlan Davis asked, eyebrows raised. Thought you were building toward your own spread someday. Plans change, Thomas replied, counting the savings he'd accumulated over years of frugal living. Is it enough to buy 80 acres? Harlan whistled low. Depends on the acres. You got land in mind. Thomas nodded. I need to get to the bank in Helena. Today. 2 weeks of frantic negotiations followed. Thomas rode countless miles between the Triple R, the bank in Helena, and the telegraph office, returning each evening exhausted but determined. Faith continued teaching, her smile growing dimmer as October approached, unaware of Thomas's efforts. On the day the Wyoming Cattle Company's representatives were due to arrive, Thomas rode to the schoolhouse at dawn. He found Faith already there, solemnly packing books into crates. I wanted one last morning here, she explained, eyes red-rimmed from crying. To remember what might have been. Thomas took a deep breath. Faith, I have something to tell you. She looked up expectantly as he withdrew documents from his vest pocket. The Wyoming company isn't coming. He handed her the first paper. I bought Jenkins' property. 40 acres, including this schoolhouse and the old homestead. Faith's eyes widened as she read the deed bearing Thomas's name. How? What? I sold my stake in the Triple R herd and borrowed against future earnings. He shrugged as if the decision had been simple rather than terrifying. As for why? Because some things matter more than just surviving. Faith's hands trembled as she held the document. Thomas, this is your future you've risked. No, he corrected gently. It's a future I've chosen. He handed her a second document. This one needs your signature. It establishes the school property in trust for educational purposes, regardless of who owns the surrounding land. The schoolhouse can never be taken away from the children. Tears spilled freely down Faith's cheeks now. I don't know what to say. There's more. Thomas continued, heart pounding. I've started work on the old Jenkins cabin. It needs considerable repairs, but it could be a proper home by winter. He swallowed hard. I hoped. That is, I wondered if you might consider sharing it. As my wife. Faith's breath caught. You're proposing marriage? Thomas nodded, suddenly unsure. I know it's sudden, and I'm just a cowhand with land I haven't properly paid for yet. You deserve better than. His words ended abruptly as Faith closed the distance between them, her hands grasping his. I deserve someone who builds schools instead of fortresses, she said softly. Someone who sees beyond mere survival to what might be created. Someone willing to risk heartbreak for the chance at joy. Her eyes shone. I believe I found exactly that in you, Thomas O'Connor. Their first kiss was witnessed only by the morning lights streaming through the schoolhouse windows. A blessing on possibilities neither had dared imagine months earlier. The wedding took place in mid-October, with the schoolhouse serving as chapel. Children scattered wildflowers before Faith as she walked toward Thomas, radiant in a cream-colored dress sewn by the women of the community. Judge Patterson performed the ceremony, pronouncing them husband and wife before the same community that had raised the building surrounding them. That evening, Thomas carried Faith across the threshold of the renovated cabin, now transformed into a cozy home with new windows, a sound roof, and furniture he'd crafted himself. "Welcome home, Mrs. O'Connor," he said, setting her gently on her feet. Faith turned slowly, taking in the polished wood floors, the riverstone fireplace, and the shelf already filled with her beloved books. "You've built all this while I was teaching? How did you manage without my noticing?" Thomas smiled. "I had help. The same people who built the schoolhouse wanted to give us a proper start." He led her to the window, where the schoolhouse was visible in moonlight. "I thought you might like being close enough to walk to work." Faith's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "It's perfect. Everything is perfect." Later, as they lay together beneath homemade quilts, the October wind singing around their sturdy home, Faith traced the lines of Thomas's face with gentle fingers. "What changed you?" she asked softly. "What made you willing to risk building something permanent after years of just surviving?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "You," he answered simply. "Watching you teach in that leaking barn, refusing to surrender to circumstances. You showed me that true survival isn't about avoiding loss. It's about creating something worth the risk of losing." Faith's smile in the firelight was worth every uncertain tomorrow. "I was wrong about the frontier," Thomas continued, pulling her closer. "It's not just a place that takes. It's also a place that makes possible what couldn't exist elsewhere. Like this, a schoolhouse built by cowboys, and a teacher who refused to teach less because conditions weren't perfect. And a man who discovered building is braver than enduring," Faith added, kissing him softly. In the years that followed, the O'Connor homestead flourished. Thomas expanded their holdings through careful management and hard work. Faith's schoolhouse gained a reputation for educational excellence that drew families from miles around. They added rooms to their home as their family grew. First a daughter with Thomas's quiet determination, then a son with Faith's bright eyes and love of books. On their 5th anniversary, Thomas took Faith to the hilltop overlooking their property. The autumn sunset gilded the schoolhouse, their home, and the productive fields between. "Did you ever imagine this the day you found me teaching in Jenkins' barn?" Faith asked, leaning against his shoulder. Thomas shook his head. "I couldn't have imagined any of it. I'd forgotten how to see possibilities." Faith squeezed his hand. "And now?" Thomas gestured toward their creation, not just buildings and fields, but a life woven with meaning, connection, and purpose. "Now I understand what you knew all along. The frontier isn't just about what we survive, but what we build to make the surviving worthwhile." As they walked home hand in hand, the schoolhouse bell caught the last light of day, gleaming like a promise kept against the vast Montana sky.